to react to some videos of press conferences from politicians like Scott Morrison to show you a little bit about the tricks of the trade and to decode some of the answers that they're giving to journalists. The first video is one that's been picked by my staff, and it's one that I definitely remember. I'm going to press play now. So this is Scott Morrison in Cairns in October in the state election, and he came up to Cairns and to Queensland to campaign for the LNP during the state election, which in the context of being a Prime Minister during a COVID pandemic in itself, says a lot about what this guy's priorities are. But he's up here talking about the things that they announced in the budget, trying to explain how that it's going to get the economy back on track. And I have to say, the video's already been rolling now for about 6 minutes. So it's taking him a long time to actually explain how he's going to create jobs in Cairns. We also have, as you can see, the uncollared, unbuttoned shirt, sleeves are rolled up. He's got some blokes in the background and he's standing in front of a workshop. So he's trying to sell the message of jobs. Whether he actually manages to do that when the journalists start asking questions, that's another matter. And we'll have a look at some of the answers that he gives in a second.
That make up the North Queensland economy. It's about cushioning that blow. It's about recovering what was lost, and it's about building for the future. Happy to take.
Here we go.
Prime Minister, are you expecting more Australians to return home in a matter of days and weeks?
Yes.
And how many will be going to Howard Springs, and what preparations are underway for people to receive that?
There have been extensive preparations undertaken on that matter, and we're in the final stages of concluding.
Okay, so I'm just going to pause it there. That's a pretty typical Scott Morrison type of answer. When he doesn't want to answer the question, he'll just give a yes or no answer. And this is a question that in October, back then, there was a lot of questions about how Australians were going to get home, where they were going to go. You'll remember that the federal government has essentially given the quarantining and responsibility for quarantine to state governments. So it's a pretty reasonable question, and he's elaborating a little bit in this follow-up, but he really doesn't want to answer the question because the answer is that they're not actually doing enough. They weren't doing enough in October, and we've still got about 40,000 people who are stuck overseas. So let's see what he says to the next question.
Working now for some months as we've been getting more and more Australians home, particularly those in vulnerable situations.
They always try and focus on whether it's a vulnerable person coming home because there should be a way of getting those people home. But gosh, they're not really trying hard enough at the moment.
And that's been great. But, I'm a bit disappointed at one level because, we were keen. When we
Scott Morrison does this a lot as well. He talks about being disappointed in the Labor Party for playing politics, disappointed in the premiers for not getting on the same page as him. It's almost like he's being a bit of an angry dad or something, disappointed at the way things are rolling out, instead of sort of acknowledging that it's a problem that he has to fix or that something that he is responsible for. It's another way of deflecting the real issue, and it's a worry that this is actually something he was saying in October. It still hasn't been fixed yet.
That would have, I think, given a lot of support to the hoteliers and the accommodation providers here in Cairns, and can also tell you that as of tomorrow, Kiwis will be having holidays in New South Wales. They'll be having holidays in the ACT, and they'll be having holidays in the Northern Territory. But I'll tell you what, there's no North Queensland in New Zealand.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop it here because this is something that Scott Morrison has talked about. He said it in October. So he's essentially saying that people from New Zealand will be able to come and have holidays in parts of Australia, but not in Queensland, because at the time the Queensland border was shut to almost everywhere, and including international visitors like New Zealand. The fact of the matter is, actually, even though we've seen that change and we've seen a change for the international border for New Zealand visitors, it hasn't created a New Zealand tourism bubble because you have to quarantine when you go back to New Zealand. So the fact that he is bringing this up here is just complete nonsense, and it's a real effort to direct people away from the things that he's failing to do and try to make out as if there's some other issue that is more important. It's absolute nonsense, and it's a concern that it's not being picked up as much, that the fact that the bubble itself is actually just a one-way road at the moment. You can't travel back to New Zealand without quarantining. So it's not a bubble at all. And he's doing this to try to attack Anastasia Palaszczuk. Remember, he's doing this in the context of the Queensland state election.
Know that the Japanese and the Chinese markets have been very important up here in Cairns for a very long time. But so has been the Kiwi market, and importantly, so has the New South Wales and Victorian market. They're both really important for tourism and
he's trying to
hospitality.
pin the economic woes of Cairns on the border closures here, and trying to make out as if it's an issue for the Queensland government alone. But what we know is that quite a lot of the visitors that used to come to Cairns were international tourists. So the international borders are actually one of the big impacts on Cairns. But of course, he's trying to deflect that responsibility away.
Prime Minister,
Yep.
the state government's insisted it's waiting for more funding support for the health response before establishing that hub. Can you say that?
So here's a question. It's a little hard to hear, but here's a question about hotel quarantining, I think.
The health support.
The health support for what?
The health response if we end up getting COVID cases and establishing a quarantine hub.
Well, that's nonsense. That's complete
So the
nonsense.
journalist has asked him a question about whether there could be some more support from the Commonwealth to provide health support if there was a COVID outbreak in quarantine. He's sort of acting as if he's never heard of this before, but really this comes back to the idea that quarantining is a federal responsibility, not a state responsibility, and they've handed it over but haven't given the same support that they should be.
Has shown that 30,000 jobs were lost in September. Does that sound an alarm that job seeker and job keeper should be extended beyond the time
That's a good
frame
question.
currently in place?
Well, including here.
Okay, so that's a question about job seeker and job keeper
Has been increasing
being
around the rest of the
extended.
country. As I said, in the last 2 months, we've had 170,000 extra jobs that have come in outside of Victoria. We've had
So what we know about
70,000
job keeper
loss
and job seeker is the government wants to stop spending this money as quickly as they can, but it's also the schemes that are keeping the economy running. So what Morrison's doing here is talking up the economy, which is weird that he's doing it in Cairns, because Cairns is one of those places that will take a bit longer to
So
recover.
given the border, he was talking about the border and quarantine. From your perspective, do you think Queensland should open its borders given how good we're going?
Look,
Another
I've been
question
very clear
about the
this. That
borders,
is a
but you'll
decision
notice
for the
Scott Morrison
Queensland
won't actually go
government.
as far to say that the borders should open. So he wants to kind of criticise and throw stones, but he won't go as far to say that the borders will open, because we knew at this stage most Queenslanders were very supportive of the border measures, because it meant that we were open and we weren't in a lockdown the same way that Melbourne was for a long time.
That's for her to explain. That's not for me to explain. But it's important that those border arrangements have been in place, particularly when the Victorian second wave hit. New South Wales has border arrangements with Victoria, and that's been important.
This is funny because it's such a backtrack from the comments about New Zealand tourists. Like, on the one hand, he's blaming the Queensland government for not allowing New Zealand tourists, but on the other hand, he's trying to say that it's a good thing that the health response and the health expert advice is being followed. He knows that he can't go that far because people will see him as, making politics out of a really
and so I
important
think
health issue.
that should weigh into the decisions about how you manage these issues. But I said from the outset of this pandemic, it was going to hit us in two ways. It was going to hit us from a health point of view, and it was going to hit us economically. And sensible governments work both of those issues at the same time, because people losing jobs, not a good thing. People's health being affected, not a good thing. So
Morrison has talked about this from the start of the pandemic, about weighing up the health issues as opposed to the economic health issues. There certainly should be a balance, but it's interesting that he always goes back to that. Here's another question.
Further exemptions could be considered, such as removing quarantine in states that have no community spread. Based on that advice, should WA be opening up?
Another question about borders, which Morrison's going to be quite careful in answering. This was at the heart in October. Remember, a lot of states were closed to each other, and there was a real heightened sense of wanting to get the borders open when there wasn't as much community transmission through the country. But the Liberals were saying that the borders should be open long before the Melbourne outbreak. And if they had been listened to, it's possible that that Melbourne outbreak could have been an outbreak all the way through Queensland. I mean, ultimately, it is about health decisions, and Morrison is trying to be very careful here because he's been caught out before by saying the wrong thing about borders, and the LNP have also said the wrong thing about borders before.
Having borders for health reasons is health policy and should only be justified on those grounds,
being very careful,
and it shouldn't be done in a double standards way. It should be done fairly, and it should be done compassionately. And I've made many private representations on those issues over the last few months. Thanks very much.
Wrap up. Okay, see you later.
And he's off. Here he goes, wrapping up the press conference. So that's the end from me as well. I hope you enjoyed my first reaction video. There'll probably be some more interesting press conferences to go, but that was a good one to start with because it really shows what the Prime Minister does when he comes to places like Cairns, where I live, and the things that he's going to talk about here. It's really disappointing to see him come all the way to Cairns and not talk more about what the plans are for the future or the plans are for jobs. But he's going to continue to do that and put more responsibility and more blame on the states for things that go wrong, so he can take the credit for when things go well. As you can see, I tend to watch a few of these, not all of them. Sometimes they're a bit to stomach, but thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll bring you some more reaction videos soon. See ya.